In a representative democracy like the United States, there has to be some way of dividing up representation across the population. While we could just draw lines on a map, it's been a basic tenet of American politics since the beginning that districts should represent roughly the same number of people. This is why the Constitution gave Congress the ability to assign seats in the House of Representatives based on new census data every 10 years, and also why it gave it the ability to expand the number of seats in the House of Representatives. Drawing the shape of the districts for these seats has long been a political process. Elected officials decide on the shapes of the districts. This gives them an incentive to draw districts in ways that would benefit them or their allies. The process of drawing districts has led to the creation of districts of all sorts of weird shapes. When it gets out of hand, we call it gerrymandering, a term coined in the 19th century to describe a sprawling district designed to support Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry. Yes, he pronounced his name Gary, but it's come down to us as Jerry, and gerrymandering has been a part of American politics ever since. Hi, I'm Evan Bennett, and I'm Professor of History at Florida Atlantic University and Director of the Voting Rights History Civic Literacy Project. And I'm here with 3 things you need to know about gerrymandering and the drawing of districts. 1. Drawing districts to benefit those who are in power is an old practice in American politics, but it's not always fallen under the definition of gerrymandering. The creation of the infamous gerrymandered district for Elbridge Gerry in 1812 is infamous in large part because of its uniqueness. Drawing such weird districts was not always common in the 19th or even into the early 20th century. Usually voters recognized the partisanship involved in drawing such strange districts, and usually rejected such naked partisanship. More common, and just as powerful, were techniques like multi-member districts, at-large districts, and malapportionment. In multi-member districts, a district would elect more than one representative. This practice was designed to concentrate power in certain areas while weakening it in others. In at-large districting, a candidate had to win the votes of a lot more people in order to take office. In the 19th century, several states that had more than one representative elected them based on an at-large election, meaning that a representative had to win the support of the entire state rather than just a local district. This was a powerful tool for outnumbering minority candidates and their voters across a state. Some states and localities used at-large voting for much the same purpose. Malapportionment is simply the practice of ignoring the relative sizes of each district. One district might have a small population and another have a large population, but they'll have exactly the same amount of representation. This usually happened because state legislators were unwilling to take away power from traditional centers of power and give them to areas of new population growth. A famous example of this is Florida, where growth in the 20th century brought more people to South Florida than North Florida. Rather than giving those areas where the population was growing more seats in the legislature simply refused to redraw the districts. This meant that some small counties in North Florida had more representation in the legislature than even large cities like Miami. The simple answer is that the Constitution says hardly anything about how districts are to be drawn, and the Supreme Court has historically deferred to state legislators in drawing of districts. In fact, in 1946, the Supreme Court decided in Colgrove versus Green that the drawing of legislative districts was a political, not a judicial matter. But that didn't last forever, too. In the 1960s, the Supreme Court changed its mind and began to enforce a principle known as one man, one vote. In these so-called one man, one vote decisions, the Supreme Court decided that congressional and legislative districts needed to be more fair. The first of these, Baker versus Carr, came in 1962. The Supreme Court decided that in fact courts could decide if districts were fair and relatively equal in legislative power. The following year, in 1963, the Supreme Court decided in Gray versus Sanders that Georgia's practice of assigning legislative seats to individual counties was unfair because it gave counties with small populations the same amount of representation as counties with large populations. Obviously, the U.S. Senate is an example of a similar sort of imbalance. However, it's written into the Constitution, so the Supreme Court could never find it unconstitutional. In 1964, in Westbury versus Sanders, another case out of Georgia, the Supreme Court decided that all congressional districts should be of roughly equal size and population. That same year, in Reynolds versus Sims, a case that came out of Alabama, the court decided the same principle applied to state legislative districts. 4 years later, in 1968, the court decided in Avery versus Midland County, which came out of Midland County, Texas, that local districts also had to be of roughly the same size. The court, however, has never barred at-large districts. The court's decisions eliminated the problem of malapportionment, but it opened the door for the greater use of gerrymandering. Charged with creating districts of roughly equal population sizes, legislators got really creative in drawing districts that would help them to secure their majorities. Aided by modern computing technology and very detailed maps of voter preference, two practices have become common. Cracking is the practice of dividing up areas that have concentrations of similarly aligned voters so that their votes are divided between several districts. Diluting, meanwhile, is the practice of putting pockets of similarly aligned voters inside larger districts with voters from the other side, effectively leaving them in the minority and unable to have much say about who's elected. Both practices increased in the 1970s as a way of limiting the political power of African American and Latino voters. In 1982, the extension of the Voting Rights Act specifically barred both practices if it could be proved that they were being used to limit the power of minority voters. Consequence of this was the practice of drawing new districts that concentrated the votes of African American or Latino voters. These minority-majority districts were seen as an acceptable compromise to ensure that African Americans and Latino voters would not lose their voices. However, in the increased partisanship of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the practice has been used to draw increasingly complex congressional districts. Indeed, nearly every state has an example of a complex, weirdly drawn district. 3. Gerrymandering has become more widely used in recent years. While there have been movements to ensure fair districts, and some states have moved to nonpartisan commissions to design their districts, the problem of gerrymandering is not going away anytime soon. In 2019, the Supreme Court decided in Rucho versus Common Cause that partisanship alone is not justification for the courts to step in the question of drawing districts. While it has not turned its back on the concept of one person, one vote, the Supreme Court has signaled in recent years that courts should defer to legislators when it comes to how districts are drawn. What this means for the future is not 100% clear, because even now the Supreme Court is handing down decisions about how districts should be drawn. What we can say with some certainty is that gerrymandering is likely to be with us for a long time.